And now on Radio 4, it's time for Call You and Yours with Winifred Robinson.
Hello, welcome to the programme today. Would you welcome fracking where you live? As the government offers licences to explore for shale, gas and oil, we'd like to know what you think. Perhaps you haven't made up your mind yet. Well, we have with us a man who'd like to help you try. Francis Egan is the Chief Executive of Quadrilla, the only company already drilling exploratory holes to frack for gas and oil in the UK. To ask him a question or tell him what you think, call 03700 100 444. Claire Smith is from Stay Blackpool and she has called us already. Claire, you would welcome fracking where you live. Tell us why.
Purely and simply because the area needs the investment. Tourism is what we do in this area. We do it really, really well. But unfortunately, it only supports, or the majority of jobs it supports, are medium to low-end jobs. And we need medium to high-end jobs. You know, we have our children, we educate them here. Then they go off to uni and then they get jobs elsewhere. You know, we really need them to stay here and you know, help support the local economy. So initially, and probably first and foremost, for me, it's about jobs.
How did you decide what you thought?
I always think that you've got to go into these things from an informed perspective. So I've attended 2 anti-fracking meetings and I've probably attended the same fracking meetings. And I've read evidence from both sides. And the result of all that investigation, from my point of view, I would say that the positives far outweigh the negatives. And at the very, very least, we've got to get the 2 applications passed to allow them to drill to explore. Because, you know, this isn't about fracking and all of that right now. What we're about is about trying to get able to explore what's down there. So it's the investigation one. Surely, at the very least, we've got to investigate the opportunities.
Claire Smith, thank you. Well, Catherine McWhirter has joined an anti-fracking group near Balcombe in West Sussex, where there were a summer of protests last year. Catherine, you're against fracking, then why?
All kinds of local reasons and national, international, global reasons, right up to climate change. I mean, in little more than a generation, we have to be well on our way out of fossil fuels, on our way to decarbonisation. And, you know, going after these last drops of oil in difficult to access rocks is really not the answer. But, I mean, locally, water pollution, air pollution, health effects, looking longer term, I mean, industrialization of the landscape, because you have to get close up to this rock to frack it, to get the gas or oil to flow. So there would be wells every couple of miles across the landscape. Cumulative effect would be huge. Water use, huge use of water. Waste, what the hell are they going to do with all this wastewater that flows back laced with radioactive substances and heavy metals, and that it's flushed out from underground, not to mention the chemicals that went in there in the first place. There are all kinds of reasons why this is just a foolish policy, and I really cannot understand why the government is pursuing it. I mean,
Catherine?
There's just so much evidence coming out of the USA now on health effects, environmental damage, on
Catherine,
fugitive methane.
I'm going to stop you there because we've got so many callers and so many emails and texts, and many people wanted to come on. Thank you very much indeed. As I said, Francis Egan, Chief Executive of Quadrilla, is with us. Welcome to Call You and Yours. Now, there are 2 big energy companies eager to frack for shale gas in the UK, yours and Celtic Energy. You are the only one that has actually started drilling these exploratory holes. So let's start with the basics then. What is fracking in a nutshell?
It's injecting high-pressure water and sand, and we propose to add one single chemical, a friction reducer, to that, which is non-hazardous and non-toxic, into shale rock to create very tiny cracks in the rock and allow gas to flow out of the rock. And the reason you do that is because the gas, of which there is a lot in the shale, we have confirmed that, will not flow out of its own accord because the rock is very impermeable or tight, as it's called in the industry.
Now, you've not had to travel far to get here because your company's drilling not far from Salford. You're drilling in Lancashire. Lots of emails, texts, tweets about the use of water and what will happen to it. Ben Grove, you want to ask Francis Egan a question about the water. What is that?
Yes, it was how his company intends to remove and dispose of the spent water used in the process.
Francis Egan?
Well, the water that comes out is taken to approved treatment plants, of which there are a number in the UK, and it's not new. They treat water from the North Sea, so water that comes from conventional reservoirs has the same characteristics, and they treat it, and then it can be returned to the environment.
Before we leave the subject of water, lots of texts about it and emails. Jane Gibbs asks, can you guarantee there's no possibility of water contamination caused by the fracking process accidentally or in the waste disposal process?
No,
No, you can't guarantee it.
No,
there won't be any.
There won't be any. I mean, you can. We have completed detailed environmental impact assessments for our proposed exploration sites in Lancashire. In fact, they were completed by an independent consultancy, Arup, who are world renowned, and they have concluded that there's negligible risk of this. I think what people need to appreciate in the UK, apart from all the measures we take to protect the groundwater, is that water supply in the UK is largely from reservoirs, but even that does come from groundwater goes through a treatment plant. So you don't get water out of the ground and into your tap. And the much cited Gaslands water coming out of a tap and being lit, it has nothing to do with shale gas. It's well known as a propaganda stunt.
Okay, another one. Peter Sanders asking, putting aside ecological questions, fracking uses millions of gallons of water in the process. Seeing as we have regular hose pipe bans, where's all this water going to come from?
Well, it comes from utility supply, and like any industrial customer, we would be behind domestic users. If there was a shortage, which certainly in the northwest there is none, our use of water for a single well is probably about less than 0.5% of what United Utilities supply on a day. So again, although the numbers sound large when you quote them in isolation, in comparative terms, we're actually a relatively modest industrial water user.
So Elizabeth Struthers is asking you, she says we're entirely dependent for water from a borehole in our neighbours' farmers' field. There must be thousands of people in the same position as us across the UK. Can we be sure our water supply will remain pure when fracking comes to Warwickshire? Well,
I'd be worried that it's not pure right now, frankly, because most of the groundwater in the UK already has methane in it. About 90-something% of the UK domestic users get their supply from utilities. So you're in a very significant minority in sourcing your water from a borehole. Anything we're doing isn't going to damage it, but if I were you, I'd be checking that water supply anyway, because as I say, even in Balcombe, the water supply has got, the groundwater rather, there has got high levels of naturally occurring methane.
If you want to take part in this conversation, call us now, 03700 100 444. We have the Chief Executive of Quadrilla, Francis Egan, to answer your questions about fracking, and we want to know if you would welcome fracking where you live. Roger Crawley is on the line from Kendal in Cumbria. Roger, you have a question for Francis Egan. Go ahead.
Well, the obvious question here is, why do we continue to exploit fossil fuels from whatever source when we have renewable energy available to develop?
Well, that's a good question.
And I give the examples of geothermal energy, hydrological sources, wave energy, tidal energy, energy saving itself. Why doesn't the government put money into this instead of into those companies who have monopolised and directed our energy use for decades?
Roger, thank you. Let's let Francis Egan answer.
Well, as I was saying, Roger, I think that's a very good question, and it's actually not an either or. It's interesting that you mentioned geothermal, because geothermal is fracking, as you probably know. You create fractures in granite rock to cycle water through it and heat that water, and it uses pretty much exactly the same techniques as hydraulic fracturing. The reason we're doing both is, I think in the UK right now, renewables accounts, excluding nuclear, for probably about 4 or 5% of our energy use. Gas is used by probably everyone on this program dialing in will use gas to heat their houses or cook their food, or both. 80% of the houses in the UK use gas for heating. So it's not going to be possible to replace that with renewables in anything less than decades. Completely setting aside electricity. If we could generate all our electricity tomorrow with renewables, we would still be using 3/4 of the gas we're using today, because we use most of it not for electricity generation, but for heating our houses and businesses and cooking. Now, the best thing we could do for climate change purposes is to replace coal with gas, which is what the US has done. And if you look at the performance in terms of CO2 emission reduction, the country, I think, that has the largest, I stand to be corrected on this is the US, and primarily driven by shale gas.
But can we really be accurately compared with the US? Because obviously it's a vast, vast continent, isn't it, with a self-contained energy market. Lots of it is wilderness. A lot of people argue, including the Energy Secretary, that there really isn't much comparison.
Well, I think that's a slightly different question in terms of how you extract or not shale gas. But the fundamental
Whether
point,
it can make the same sort of contribution.
Absolutely. I mean, we currently generate 46% of our electricity with coal, half of it imported from Russia. So if we focus more of our efforts on replacing that coal with gas, which is achievable in the short term, we would do far more to reduce CO2 emissions. I mean, we're in the ridiculous situation where INEOS are going to import shale gas from America to fuel their Grangemouth plant, yet we're arguing against exploiting it here.
Roger Crawley?
Well, I still cannot understand why we have to place so much emphasis and so much money on the exploitation of fossil fuels. The other one I didn't mention was solar. Even in a cloudy country like ours, we can still generate energy from the sun, and the sun can provide all of the energy that we need on this planet.
Roger.
Why do we not go for these renewable sources? Why do we have to continue to put money into these fossil fuels?
Roger, Francis Egan's answer to that was that we can't do it within the timescales that we have, and we can't generate enough. I think we'll leave it there and go now to Brian Bowler. Brian, you have a couple of questions that you would like to put, I think.
Yes, please.
Well, welcome to you and yours. Go ahead.
First one, the gas produced by fracking is largely methane, a very dangerous greenhouse gas. What proportion of the gas extracted by fracking leaks to the atmosphere? And my second question, the government has turned against onshore wind generation of energy, a sustainable source, because some people object to the appearance of wind turbines. So why is it subsidising fracking, whether local communities want it or not, which requires similar intrusions on the landscape?
So let me take those in turn, Brian. The methane, as you say, is a greenhouse gas, and of course it's common in the UK, as I already mentioned. It's everyone has it in their houses for cooking and heating. We would estimate less than 1% emissions, and we can control those emissions in the UK. The largest source of emissions from shale gas, from US experience, has been from the practice of storing flowback water in open pits, and the methane then degasses from that water over time and goes directly into the atmosphere. That practice is, one, not carried out, and two, not allowed in the UK. And by that alone, eliminating that alone, I think you eliminate probably about 90% of emissions associated with shale gas. The other sources are the ones that are common already in our transportation system, which are leaking valves or compressor stations, which are really down to good maintenance. And it's much better that, in my view, that we do that here rather than import our gas from countries that frankly have far lower environmental standards than the UK. Your second question on onshore wind and subsidies, I have to say there has not been a penny of subsidy to shale gas in the UK. All the money that has been spent so far is investors' money, and the government have not put 1 cent into it. They have announced potential tax breaks for production, but as nobody is in production, and that's just a reduction in tax, we would still pay in excess of 50% tax, going up to probably 62% plus, so probably the highest corporate tax rate in the UK. So there is no subsidies for exploring or developing shale gas in the UK. This is all investors' money, and these are UK companies that, certainly Quadrilla and iGas are UK companies looking to exploit that.
Ryan Bowler, thank you for that one. Let's move now to another block of questions which have come in. They are all about people's property and the environment in which they live, their roads, their shops, their houses. Maggie Coles is on the line from Shepton Mallet in Somerset. Maggie, you have a question to Francis Egan about who will pay for any damage to property.
Yes. I'd like to know who's going to pay for any damage caused to personal property, because I asked my insurance company the question, would I be covered for any damage to my property caused by fracking, knowing that they would likely have done a risk assessment on this? And the answer was not if it's within 200 metres of my property. So this tells me that they consider fracking to be a risk and could cause damage to property. So who will be paying for the damage if the insurance companies aren't going to?
Just before you answer, Rob Clark has asked the same question. In the unlikely scenario, albeit, that my home is damaged through fracking, would your company pay for the repairs? If you could perhaps answer those.
Well, the short answer to that is yes. If we have caused it, we carry insurance, and we would respond to that. But also, the Association of British Insurers have said that there are not exclusions for fracking. None of the current house insurance policies carry exclusions for fracking. So I think it depends slightly what question you ask. If you ask, have you got specific insurance for fracking? Nobody has that, but they do not exclude that from your as a risk from your current insurance policy.
Maggie, how did you come to be asking about it then?
Well, I suppose like most thinking people, I take an interest in environmental matters, and I was curious to know, because if an insurance company won't, if they consider anything to be a risk, they won't cover you for it. And I know what he's just said, but that's not what I've been told by the insurance companies. They're saying, no, within 200 metres of your property, we will not cover you.
Francis Egan, I suppose the other question is that won't you do what all good businesses do and try and protect your profits and fight it tooth and nail? I mean, you're not going to be rolling over paying people for subsidence, are you, all over the UK?
Well, subsidence is a different issue. And
cracking of their property because of earth tremors and so on.
Well, I'll just repeat what I said. If we cause cracking...
But you'll fight it, won't you? You won't roll over and say, hands up, we caused it.
No, if we caused it, we will obviously want to see that we have caused it. And that's I think, perfectly reasonable. Then we will rectify it. But that risk is tiny.
But you can understand, can't you, that I'd be one little person and you'd be one big person with a multi-million-pound company behind you, wouldn't you, to fight my claim?
Well, Quadrilla is a small company, actually, a small UK company, and we will respond. If we have caused it, we will respond to it. I don't know how many times I can say that, but that's what I've said.
OK, Elizabeth Leake has asked, she says, I live in Fylde. I cycle along narrow country lanes where these drilling sites are located. The roads in these areas are already in a poor state. Will there be investment in the wider area to help accommodate the many hundreds of people using these roads if fracking goes ahead?
Well, again, yes. I mean, clearly, transport infrastructure is very important and a key part of the environmental impact assessment, which is for the two sites we're proposing is publicly available from Lancashire County Council. And if there is investment needed, and generally the council decides that as part of a planning condition, then the companies pay for it.
This is Call You and Yours, and today we are asking if you would welcome fracking where you live. You probably haven't made up your mind about that yet, but perhaps you have. Perhaps you're already living alongside some of the existing exploratory drilling sites in Lancashire. Please call us now. Tell us what it's like. 03700 100 444. We have the Chief Executive of Quadrilla, Francis Egan. He's here answering your questions. We also ask you to email us, youandyours@bbc.co.uk, and our reporter Bob Walker is reading those emails today. Bob, tell us what people are saying.
Well, the striking thing really is there's just very little faith in any of the reassurances that are given. That comes through quite strongly. Dean Hines says there's increasingly evidence from the United States shows the practice to be dangerous to the environment and to people, dirty, wasteful, resource heavy, and with the potential for long-term environmental damage. Paul Murphy emails us from the Netherlands with a list of report he says shows that fracking is responsible for major health problems. Marion Stonehouse is in France, and she says fracking there has led to polluted groundwater supplies. And as you touched on earlier, more than one listener we have many emails, people wanting to know what happens to the dirty water used in this process and specifically what chemicals are being used. We've also had another listener from Bolcombe, Sarah Reynolds. She's very angry. She says, my family and I are unfortunate to live in Bolcombe, where drilling was carried out against the wishes of the vast majority of the villagers. It was and is the most horrifying part of our lives. Huge trucks containing chemicals thunder past the children's school, police everywhere, brown water, she says, caused by their vibrations from drilling. And she says all the wildlife vanishing overnight. So she says, what gives Mr Egan and the government the right to ruin our lives? One listener says, let's have a referendum among the Conservative MPs and see how many would vote for fracking in their area. But I ought to say that there are supporters as well. Rory McFadden says, unfortunately, no one wants nuclear power, no one wants coal-fired power stations, no one wants windmills. But fracking is not going to solve the nation's energy needs, but it could help keep the lights on. And finally, Steve Wilson in Lanarkshire says, coal provided generations of jobs in his neck of the woods. Perhaps fracking can do the same.
Thanks, Bob. If you want to send a text, 84844. If you want to follow us on social media, the hashtag's you and yours. Francis Egan's with me on Call You and Yours today. He's the chief executive of Quadrilla. It has exploration sites in the Bowland Shale Basin in Lancashire. Francis Egan, you are going where you're not wanted, aren't you?
Well, the public opinion surveys actually demonstrate that there are more people supportive than against it. You wouldn't tell that from what we've just heard from your phone-ins, but actually the BBC's own survey in the Northwest shows that there's more people supportive of it than against it. I think the issue with any development is when it actually becomes to your doorstep, then there is greater degree of concern and resistance to any development.
The thing about this country as compared with America is that we don't own the minerals and gas under our own land, do we? Whereas in America they do. So that's why they welcome fracking, because it's like striking oil.
No, I think that's a much, if I may say, circulated myth, because what that actually does in America is create even bigger division, because you get people under whose land it's being extracted, generating a lot of money, and then people who are sitting on the road beside it with some traffic going by getting nothing. So
there aren't the rewards in it for us, are there, in that sense? Because no one is going to benefit directly from what is found under their land, because mineral rights in this country belong to the Crown.
Well, and again, it depends how you look at it. The tax rate is approximately 75%, so the vast majority of the money goes to the government and therefore the taxpayer. It's up to the government to decide how they allocate that between central and local county councils, and that's not for Quadrilla to decide. And at the end of the day, this is not Quadrilla's gas. This is the UK's gas. The gas is actually the property of the Queen, and through her, or the Crown, the people of the UK. So all the people on the gas, and as that was a decision that was taken decades ago, and I don't think will be reversed lightly as to why should you own it rather than me.
Now, you're facing challenges in the courts, aren't you, by individual landowners who are challenging your right to drill deep, deep, deep in the earth under their land. And as I understand it, the government is looking at changing the law to allow you to do that.
Well, we're not as a company facing those challenges, but the government is looking to allow companies such as ours to drill where it's greater than 3,000 meters, I think is the 3,000 feet below ground. Now, this is just to put it in context. This is a 6-inch diameter hole, 3,000 feet below ground. So the impact on anyone's property is going to be non-existent. It's exactly the same as an airplane, for example, flying above your property, where it's a mile above your property. The difference being, of course, that property owners own the rights to the centre of the earth, but not to the outer reaches of the atmosphere.
Let's take another question then. Jake White is on the line from London. Jake, what do you want to ask Francis Egan?
Yes, thanks. I just wondered whether Francis Egan could clarify what, if any, plans Quadrilla has to apply for petroleum exploration and development licences in national parks or areas of outstanding natural beauty, or indeed World Heritage sites, in the light of yesterday's announcement by government that it was seeking to toughen up protection against fracking in those areas. And a follow-up question was that if indeed it does intend or is not ruled out the possibility of applying for licenses which would cover those kinds of protected areas, if it proved that it was easiest for the company to gain access to the hydrocarbons from those protected areas, would Quadrilla then apply for planning permission to do so?
Well, thank you for the question, Sheikh, and I recognise the name from your frequent correspondence as a legal advisor to Friends of the Earth. So
well done.
It's nice of you to call in person.
Sure.
So I have to say, he did tell us that. I saw it on the screen and I didn't read it out. It's my fault.
No, Jake corresponds with us frequently. So, Jake, you won't be surprised that the 14th licensing round, as I said, is a competitive process, and no company will tell you what it's going to bid on, because it's in competition with other companies. So I hate to disappoint you, but I won't answer exactly where we're going to bid. And frankly, I couldn't today because the round was only announced yesterday, so we've hardly had a chance to look at what's on offer, much less decide where we're going to bid. But we will look at what's on offer, and whatever conditions are put in, planning guidance conditions, will abide by it, clearly.
Jake White, thank you.
Sure. It's just that, the government planning policy on this point is quite clear, isn't it? It says that fracking will only be possible in exceptional circumstances. So, I wondered if rather than sort of kind of disclosing, anything commercially confidential, you could give us an idea as to what those exceptional circumstances would be in the mind of the company.
Well, it'll be a case-by-case basis, Jake. As I say, we haven't decided, one, whether we'll apply for licenses. So clearly, we're very clear we are going to look at it. Two, where. And when we've decided that, we will look at it on a case-by-case basis. We conduct, in any event, an environmental impact assessment before we would carry out fracturing operations anywhere, be it in a national park or outside a national park.
Jake White, environmental lawyer at Friends of the Earth. Thank you very much for calling us. Thanks for letting us in on what had until now been a private conversation. It's 29 minutes past 12. This is Call You and Yours on BBC Radio 4. I'm Winifred Robinson. Today we're asking if you would welcome fracking where you live. The government's offering new licences for exploratory drilling. There are shale, oil and gas reserves in Scotland, Wales and the north and south of England, and the exploratory drilling would be to see how much of that, if any, can be extracted. Please call us now to tell us what you think. 03700 100 444. We have the Chief Executive of Quadrilla, Francis Egan, with us in the studio to take your calls, and we'll be taking more of them in a minute. First, though, Edward Sturton wants to tell us what's coming up in the world at 1. Edward.
Winifred, thank you. The Prime Minister says he'll cut the length of time for which EU immigrants can claim key benefits. But how many people will it hit, and does it really amount to a crackdown, as the government claims? Have you switched to a diesel car because you thought it was greener? Boris Johnson has bad news for you. You'll have to pay extra if you want to drive it in the capital. The London Mayor joins us live. Say the word drones, and for many of us, military strikes come to mind, but could they soon be friendly things you use about the house? And the passions generated by the Gaza conflict spill over onto the cricket pitch. All in the world at 1.
Thank you, Edward. Well, today on Call You and Yours, we're asking, would you welcome fracking where you live? The phone number to take part in this conversation, 03700 100 444. The government's making licenses available for companies who want to carry out exploratory drilling for shale gas and oil. The Chancellor's right behind it. George Osborne has said, I would love fracking to get going in the UK. I'm doing absolutely everything I can to encourage it. Do you feel the same? Well, a report from the Institute of Directors suggests it could support 74,000 jobs, all very controversial suggestions, of course. And protesters, though, believe it's a dangerous technology, say it uses toxic chemicals, and that mining disasters in the past proved that communities would be put at risk. Tell us what you think. 03700 100 444. Francis Leader is on the line. Francis, you have some personal experience of campaigning against fracking. You live in Balcombe, is that right?
No, actually, I live in Dorset, which is going to be fracked from the 1st of November if they get past our blockade. I was at Balcombe for the entire summer as part of the protection camp that was there. Then I was at Barton Moss protecting against IGAS. And now I am in the north again because we have 3 protection camps running at the moment. 2 near Hull and 1 in Cheshire. And I have a very important pile of questions I'd like to ask.
Can we whittle it down to 1? Because there are a lot of other people waiting to put some questions. Thank you. Go ahead, Francis.
The most important one. I attended a conference in London recently, a Gov Today conference, during which we had the opportunity to question people that were presumably quite high up in the industry. I was very, very curious about the plans that Francis Egan has for disposing of the fluids and solids that result from fracking.
Okay, Francis, let's if I could just stop you there, let's take that answer again.
That they weren't invented yet, and I would like to know, does he plan to spray them on the roads like they do in America and Australia?
Okay, well,
Does he plan to leave them laying around in bags in deserted houses.
OK, Francis, I'm going to stop you there and give Mr Egan a chance to answer. He has taken this question once before. If you would answer it again, what happens to the dirty water? You're going to do with it what the Americans have done?
No, is the short answer. It's incorrect to say that there are no plants that can treat it in the UK. The water that's extracted from these reservoirs, as I've said in my earlier answer, there are similar waters extracted from conventional reservoirs in the North Sea, taken onshore and treated. We have identified a number of plants. We're in commercial negotiations with those plants, and the details of our flowback water are on the Environment Agency website. We need a permit from the Environment Agency to deal with it. If you log on, there's nothing secret about it. If you log on to the Environment Agency website, you'll find a detailed compositional analysis of that water. It has to be sampled on the site, transported off the site to an Environment Agency approved treatment facility, of which, as I say, there are a number and more being developed in the UK, and treated. There is absolutely no question of it being dumped on the side of the road, which is an often circulated myth, and I'd like to see the evidence for that in the UK.
Francis Leader, thank you for that. We have David Shuckman, the BBC's news science editor, with us. David, you probably heard from that bit of the debate, it is a very heated one. If your area is granted a licence, is there much that you can do to drive fracking away if you don't want it?
Well, the starting point is to see whether the landowner wants it. I mean, the companies like Quadrilla and others need the permission of a landowner to drill the first well. Now, if that's not forthcoming, that's an immediate block. I mean, secondly, they also need planning permission from the local authority. And if there's massive opposition, that's perhaps unlikely to be forthcoming. It is possible that Whitehall could overrule a local authority, but then you have to enter the realms of, well, how much local opposition is that going to stir up? I mean, be a different calculation locally.
David, maybe you can answer this question, which is coming in from a lot of our listeners. Vince Adams, for example, on email. He is asking why, with climate change and global warming, such an urgent problem, we're not turning more of our attention to investing in renewable energy. Now, what Francis Egan said about that is that we can't do it quickly enough and on the scale we would need to bridge the gap. Is that true?
Well, interestingly, the United Nations Climate Panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looked at this issue and did say that if gas replaces coal, which is a dirtier fossil fuel, then it could be seen as a bridge towards a low-carbon future. In other words, the best thing in their view, the collective view of the UN climate scientists, was to try to, as a priority, get off coal, and if gas was the next best alternative on the way to renewables being far more widespread and cheaper and more viable, then that was the right way to go.
David Shuckman, thank you. The phone number to call to take part in this conversation, 03700 100 444. Also with me for the second half of the programme, I have Professor Ernie Rutter. He's a specialist in structural geology at the University of Manchester. And you heard David Shuckman there making comparisons with America. He's been to America. They've been fracking there for decades. Some of our callers made comparisons with America. What are the big lessons that we can learn from what has happened there?
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The important thing is that the American experience has shown us that the development of a shale gas industry can have a huge impact on gas prices. Now, I'm not suggesting that the same impact we've felt in this country, but it certainly has been the case in America. Also, if the United States had signed up to the Kyoto protocol on climate change, they would be the only country on the planet that was actually meeting its obligations, because burning gas instead of coal produces less greenhouse emissions. And in this country, we probably wouldn't get the same impact in terms of prices because our prices are tied into the European market, but we should see stabilisation, and it might even turn into a reduction if our European neighbours were to come on board as well. So in this country we have a significant number of people who are facing problems of fuel poverty, and this is only going to get worse if energy prices keep rising. Gas prices suggested, if we don't do anything about it, might rise by 30% over the next 15 years, whereas they might stay fairly stable if we develop a shale gas industry. And it's really important for people who do face fuel poverty to be able to see coming on stream something which might help to stabilise that inexorable rise in energy prices.
Professor Ernie Rutter, thank you for now. Stay with us. You can respond to some more of our callers. David Field is waiting to come on. David, tell us what you think. Would you welcome fracking where you live?
Well, yes, I really would. I believe a lot of the reaction that you've been that we've all been listening to is almost hysterical. You know, I would prefer a 3,000-foot hole in my garden 6 inches across than a windmill across the valley. I live in glorious Devon. I live in probably one of the most lovely parts of South Devon, the South Hams, and I resent the intrusion upon the scenery and the attraction which it has for the huge tourist population of these wretched windmills and that sort of thing. By comparison, it seems to me fracking offers so much. It offers fuel security for this nation, which we certainly don't have now, particularly with the Russian scene the way it is and the Middle East the way it is. If we can reduce the amount of dependence we have upon such dubious sources, clearly there is national benefit. And down here in the West Country, we do have unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. And the main diversion of those young folk into maintaining the second homes of the rich and that sort of thing, which I much prefer the approach of an industry to actually employ these people and develop their expertise.
David, have you been to Lancashire and had a look at some of these bore sites?
What I've seen has been what I've seen on television. I'm sorry, no, I haven't actually visited the sites.
Professor Rutter has seen them, I think. How would you say they compare then? Are they uglier than a windmill?
No, I don't think they are. And
are they as ugly?
I don't think they're ugly at all. And generally, they're quite well styled, and the number of these sites is likely to be not so large as to be as intrusive as with windmills. But I think our caller has hit one of the important nails on the head, that although he lives in a place where there is unlikely to be any shale gas development because the geology is wrong, it is important to recognise that if energy prices can be stabilised in this country, that's a big boost to industries which are very energy intensive. For example, the nitrogen-based fertiliser industry, which uses huge amounts of energy, has to sell these products abroad. And also other organisations, companies which might be based, for example, in the southwest, who would benefit from having stabilised energy prices.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the landscape impact. It is true that while the sites are being developed, there is a drilling rig on site, so you can see that it does have an impact. But that's typically for a site, if you're developing a production site, 2 to 3 years. Once the drilling rig goes away, you're left with a series of what are called wellheads, valves, about the size of a post box. Any processing plant would likewise be low in height, easily screened, and you will literally not know it's there. It's not. I have nothing against wind turbines. I have to say I actually find them quite attractive. I'm probably in the minority in that, but being an engineer, there you are. But it is nothing compared to a wind turbine. You will not hear it and you will not see it once it's in operation, and it can be in operation for decades after going into production.
The RSPB and some other environmental charities, they believe that the danger, if you do develop in Lancashire, is that you will displace bird life, don't they? They're worried particularly about a kind of swan, isn't it? And is it a pink-footed goose?
The hooper swans and pig-footed goose, which of course are considered in our environmental assessment. I find it somewhat ironic that the RSPB are pro-wind turbines and anti-shale. I don't think we've ever done harm to a single bird.
No, the worry is that you're driving them off their feeding grounds.
No, we actually, the sites themselves are relatively small. A typical shale gas site is about the size of 2 football pitches, about 5 acres. We create a feeding area for birds to offset that, and in fact there is no indication of reduction in bird numbers, quite the opposite in fact from our activities.
Let's go back to some more of our callers now and take some calls about jobs, which is another big area where you've been emailing and ringing and texting. Angela, what did you want to ask Francis Egan?
Hello. my main concern here is who benefits. The bottom line of any business is financial gain. We already know the overwhelming evidence, environmental evidence, the damage that's done in the USA, and that it's been banned totally in Germany. And here we're talking about trying to persuade people that there will be stabilisation of gas prices, which is a rather absurd thing to say, because this is not going to be a sustainable practice. You know, we are supposed to be looking at sustainable alternatives. Fracking was halted in Blackpool because it triggered earthquakes. Any geologist who studies fracking would know that you cannot have total control over the extent of the fracturing. Once they've actually fractured, they don't know how far it's going to go. Hence, we had the earthquakes in Blackpool. So
Angela
two
Salisbury.
areas here. We've got the financial who benefits, and we've got the environmental who benefits.
Angela Salisbury, let's stop. Let me stop you there
benefits.
and give Francis Egan a chance to answer those.
Well, let me answer the financial, and then I might turn to the expert on my right, who is a professor in structural geology, who can talk about the claims about seismic events. Financially, the biggest beneficiary will be UK PLC. As I say, the tax rate is typically up to 75%. The jobs will be created in the UK. Quadrilla is a UK company, pays tax in the UK. 90-something plus % of our employees are UK citizens, and Adventure iGas is pretty much the same. So the largest beneficiary will be the UK. In terms of prices, if I just might say something about that, I mean, people talk about price reduction. I think we need to put this in some kind of context. Hinkley power station, the nuclear power station, signed up, yet to be constructed, has signed up an electricity price which is 3 times the current electricity price. Offshore wind is 3 times the current electricity price. Onshore wind is twice the current electricity price. So, if gas could stabilise prices, never mind cause them to reduce, it would be a huge benefit. We are facing a huge price crunch yet to come. We have seen nothing like the worst of pricing in energy in the UK.
Angela, so that's the answer about price. Does that satisfy you?
Into the land on which the windmills are being put, and the interests. Mrs. Cameron has family connections, and they are the biggest.
I can't go into that, Angela, because obviously I haven't researched that. We don't have Mrs. Cameron here to answer that.
Within the Trough of Bowland, the Queen Mother had an estate there, so we also have the royal family connected. The land here, when you're talking about 2 football pitches, once fracking is finished, that land is rendered barren. It cannot be used for anything.
Angela, thanks. Let's let Professor Rutter answer those questions. Angela's worried about what will happen when they...
Well, first of all, I am a geologist, and I do know something about fracturing of rocks. And since hydraulic fracture started in 1947, there have been 2.5 million fracking operations carried out on this planet. About more than 100,000 of those have been in connection with the exploitation of shale gas, mostly in the United States. Now, it's not true to say that we don't know where these cracks go. They are monitored as they grow. A typical fracked well will involve, say, 20 hydraulic fractures being induced. These run to about 30 metres high, and they propagate laterally, if you're lucky, 200 or 300 metres each way. So they're like big butterfly wings extending away from the borehole. All this at about 3 kilometres depth beneath the surface. Now, these fractures are so-called opening mode fractures. They are simply prized open by the fluid. They make a small amount of noise, and this is how we track them from the surface, by listening to the little noises they make as they go. So we do know where they grow. It's very, very difficult to persuade fluids to induce tremors in connection with fracking a well. It's very hard to persuade fluids to go into a differently oriented, pre-existing, hydraulically conductive crack in such a way that it can generate slippage, which would cause an earthquake. In all those 100,000 plus fracking operations that have been employed in the past 15 years or so, I only know 3 instances where properly documented occurrences of small tremors have occurred.
One of them on the filed.
Exactly.
And so you distinguish then between a small tremor and what you believe people are really worried about,
And
which is earthquake.
the kinds of tremors we're talking about are the same sort of size of tremors, really quite small, like a truck driving along outside, that the people who live in the English Midlands have lived with in connection with coal mining induced tremors for 150 years. They're not really any significant cause for concern at all.
Professor Russell, thank you for that. Fiona Young is in Shropshire. Fiona, what was your point, or did you have a question?
Well, one of my points is that I don't believe it's possible to regulate this industry, because you can't regulate against spills, leaks, accidents, human error, earthquakes. You simply can't. You can make sure they're less likely to happen, but you can't stop them happening. And we can't afford to take any risk with our water supply.
But don't we take risks all the time? When we get into a car or get on a plane, nothing in this world is completely safe.
But water is our most precious commodity. We cannot, no level of risk is acceptable with our water supply.
Well, again, I'll go back to one of the earlier questions. It seems to be, again, a belief that water comes out of the ground and into our taps. I might just a few points here. One, somebody has said we're putting toxic chemicals into the ground.
Yes, we had another email asking you exactly what the chemicals are.
We are putting one chemical, non-toxic, non-hazardous to groundwater, has to be approved by the Environment Agency, who have already said they will not approve any chemical additives unless they are non-hazardous to groundwater.
So what is it?
It is polyacrylamide. It's a friction reducer. It's typically also found in contact lens solution, for example. The reason it's used is that when you're pumping water 2 kilometres underground through a pipe, you lose a lot of pressure from friction with the pipe. This reduces the pressure loss, means you have to use less power and therefore less fuel and less emissions at the surface. And I'll repeat again, it's non-hazardous, non-toxic chemical. It's typically called slick water. That is the one and only chemical additive that we are proposing for our jobs in Lancashire. And the Environment Agency puts it on their website and has to approve any chemicals. So this, I can't speak for the US. There probably have been lots of other chemicals tried in the US, but that's not the case in the UK or the European Union.
Another listener's texted to ask, why is fracking banned in France?
That's a very good question, which you'll have to ask the French.
Is it really banned? I mean, you see reports in the papers that the French have said there must be a moratorium on fracking. I'm assuming that your company would like to prove it can be done well here and then move across Europe, wouldn't you?
Well, as soon as it's successful in the UK, I would be very interested in the French reaction.
And what's happening in Poland? Because we were told that had vast reserves, and then we were also told that it wasn't as promising as people thought.
Which is fairly typical of exploration. It generally goes through cycles of it's the saviour of the universe to it's the depths of despair before it settles out at something which is its ongoing production rate.
Let's go over now to Bob Walker, our reporter, who's reading some of the emails as they're coming in to you and yours at bbc.co.uk. Bob, I know it's a very unscientific survey, but in the main, would you say our listeners are in favour of fracking or against?
No doubt, very, very much against it, I have to say. We're still getting lots of emails about the whole environmental impacts, as I said before, despite the reassurances that are given. But also there's questions about the whole planning process. Cornelie Osborne says she thinks the government's policy for fracking is undemocratic and potentially very harmful. Undemocratic because there was almost no sustained, informed public discussion before half the country was potentially opened up to fracking. I think on property prices as well, Brian Woodgate says if my property value falls because people don't want to live near a fracking site, even if there's no damage, could we pay for a drop in the property prices? Jane Watson from Bassett Law in Nottinghamshire, she says a company's been given a licence to test near her village, and she questions whether any of the regulatory authorities have the resources to closely monitor the impact of fracking across the country. Charlotte Watson's email, she says the government's move to offer protection to areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks, that's an acknowledgement, she says, that there are potential problems, so why not ban it outright? But again, we do have supporters. Mike Barnes says this could be vital to the future of the UK and the answer to the government's deficit problems, as Mr Egan touched upon. And finally, James Marginson is in favour. He admits there are questions that need answering. He says, why not set up a visitor centre like they have ones for nuclear energy?
Thanks, Bob, for that. Florence Rolson is on a mobile phone. Florence. Hello, are you there? Hi, welcome to You and Yours. How old are you, Florence?
I'm 16.
And I understand that you have studied fracking at GCSE. What did you learn?
We learned that it destroys landscapes and makes them unusable for the future. We also learned that it's a quite short-term energy source, and that it's just very bad for global warming. And being a young person, I was thinking for the future of our society, that if we continue using non-renewable energy sources, we are just going to increase the level of global warming and increase the amount of problems that we're going to have in the future.
Florence, thank you. We're coming to the end of the programme now, and perhaps I should ask both of our guests, Francis Egan, Chief Executive of Quadrilla, and Professor Ernie Rutter from Manchester University, who's a specialist in structural geology. The question that I asked the audience right at the start: would you welcome fracking near where you live? Professor Rutter?
Oh yes, very much so. As simple as that.
Why?
I believe that that the country comes first, and as Francis has pointed out, it is very important that the principal beneficiary, UK PLC, should receive the benefit from the development of a shale gas industry. So how can I possibly object to having fracking activity at the bottom of my garden?
Francis Egan, is anybody likely to frack near where you live?
Well, I hope so, but time will tell. Quadrilla doesn't have any licences near us. It's our competitor, iGas, who does. I'd much prefer it was us for obvious reasons, but you won't be surprised to hear that I would support it. I listened to that last caller with interest, and I'd like to invite her to come and visit one of our sites if she wants to, so that she can actually see. I don't know whether they show what they showed in her GCSE class, but if we're serious about actually doing something about climate change, rather than talking about it, then we need to produce our own gas. Because we will be using gas in this country for decades to come. We're not going to stop heating our homes, and although the Green Party thinks we can reduce energy demand by 60%, I don't believe there's a plan to actually do that. So we either import gas from Russia, from Qatar, from North Africa, where the environmental standards are far lower than here, at greater cost to the climate, or we try and do it in our own country with our own people.
If we just take one more call. Bill Walsh, tell me what you wanted to say.
It was just regarding your very first caller from the Fylde Coast. She's under the impression that fracking will suddenly flood Blackpool, Fleetwood, Cleavers and so on with jobs. This is just not the case, and one of your experts said this
Bill, I must stop you because we've come to the end, but I wanted to get you in because I think what you summarise is the huge scepticism that there is between the people and big industry in the UK. I don't know what you're going to do about that, but thank you very much, Francis Egan, Chief Executive of Quadrilla, for coming in today to take your calls, and also to Professor Ernie Rutter from Manchester University. That's it for today. Tomorrow we'll be revealing what trading standards officers found when they went looking for evidence of a very old-fashioned food fraud. It'll be me tomorrow just after midday.
Call You and Yours was